agenda is approval of the minutes from the, pardon me, waiting for my computer to catch up, from the March 16th, 2010 meeting.
I move approval of the minutes of the March 16th meeting.
Oh, second.
Been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the March 16th, 2010 meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None being heard, motion carries. Item number 2, application Z98-8B filed by Bieberly Architects, PA, on behalf of Deepa Hospitality Group, LLC, requesting approval of an amendment to an existing PC3 planned shopping center district and the approval of final site development plan for the proposed hotel with a building height of 46 feet. The subject property is legally described as Lot 7 and a portion of Lot 1, Block 1 of the replat of Auburndale addition to the City of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, and amended as 3145 South 9th Street. Continued from the March 16, 2000 meeting to allow revisions to be made to the site plan. Dean?
I'm going to have Mr. Herz report where we are in this, but I was just going to explain our agenda today. So we have item 2 as a continuation item. There's no representative for that today. They acknowledge that they're still working on the site plan and doing some additional engineering work. Item 3 is a public hearing item, and item 4 is not a public hearing item, but it was an item that started with you and was referred out of the Planning Commission. And so staff is reporting back to you on item 4. I'll let Mr. Herz update you on what's happening out south on South 9th Street.
Thanks, Dean. I spoke with the design architect on the project, and after our last meeting in which the Bieberly Architects was the representative for the developer, we supplied the architect and the designer and the developer with a punch list items of things to be corrected. They're still working on those items, and so even though we had a recommendation to postpone the case item to this meeting, we are now going to be requesting that we postpone it until further information is brought to us. That way we can just bring it to you whenever they're ready, rather than bringing it to you every time we meet and them not having information. So they are hopeful that our next meeting they'll have something, but staff would recommend that we just postpone any action on this until those revisions that we submitted in a letter to the developer be resubmitted to us.
Thank you.
So I think just a motion to postpone until revised plans are received is appropriate.
I'd make a motion to postpone until revised plans are submitted.
I'd second that.
Been moved and seconded to postpone application Z98-8B until the plans are finalized and submitted. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None being heard, motion carries. Item number 3, application PDD-10-2 filed by Ashby House Limited, requesting a change in zoning district classification from R3 multifamily residential district to PDD planned development district to establish and operate a commercial child care center in an existing residential dwelling. The subject property is legally described as all of lots 140, 141, and 142 on Walnut Street in the original town of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, and addressed as 204 South 8th Street. Dean?
I'd like to recuse myself, be part of the audience for this because it's USD 305 is involved with this particular
good.
application.
Alyssa, let the record show that Ken has recused himself on this item. Thank you. Dean?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is an application to change the zoning classification on a property located at the corner of 8th and Walnut, and the purpose for the zoning change is that the residential zoning classification does not contemplate or provide an avenue for taking a existing dwelling and converting it to child care unless the operator of the child care is residing there. So this property is what I think of as the former Sensabaugh home. The Sensabaughs lived there for many, many years there at the corner of 8th and Walnut. The house is currently vacant, and the plan is to convert it from residential use to a child care center. The child care program may involve children who reside at Ashby House, but the actual operation will be from the Heartland early education program, and the facility will be open to more than just Ashby House residents. And the Heartland Early Education Program is a collaboration of Head Start, the Educational Cooperative, and the Health Department, and they are situated out at the former Kennedy School where they operate programs out there. They would be the facilitators and operators of this. We provided for you on page 2 the definitions there of child care center. And a child care center is a facility that provides care for more than 13 children, usually open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. Child care centers are inspected once a year by the Health Department. They've got many standards pertaining to health, safety, learning, staff qualifications, staff-to-child ratios. We do have child care centers in residential zoning districts, but they are all in non-residential buildings, such as churches, the YMCA, and the Martin Luther King Center. We do have one exception on South 9th Street. So a conditional use permit was not really an option here because this is not a non-residential building. And child care centers are considered commercial uses because of the number of children they provide care for and the fact that the dwellings or whatever the facility is not used for residential purposes. And John, I think you had a table there that showed the current child care centers in the city. Let's just give you an idea of child care centers we have in the city of Salina today. As you can see on the right-hand side, all but one are in a commercial building or a church. And the only exception to that is a house that's on South 9th Street, which was approved for child care before our current regulations and the state regulations went into place. The Salina City Commission, when they've looked at this issue, has had a consistent policy against purchasing homes in residential neighborhoods and converting them to commercial uses. And the other thing that comes into play is that there are many more building code challenges that apply when it's no longer used as a residential dwelling. But this request before you is twofold. One is to look at a change to Planned Development District to allow child care in an unoccupied dwelling. The second aspect of this is to look at the plan for operating the child care at this location. In other words, look at the site plan. Are there any child care facility improvements needed or other types of site improvements needed to serve a child care operation at this location? I think you've got a vicinity map in your packet. It's mostly residential property surrounding this. You have the Ashby House. You have the former First Christian Church, now Blue Heaven Studios, and the Pioneer President's Place with residential housing farther to the south. And so your role in this hearing is to look at the dwelling and use and would it still be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood if it was converted to child care, and then to look at the applicant's plan for safely operating a facility at this location. We've looked at this, and other than the concern and potential complication of trying to do this in a dwelling that was designed for residential habitation, our primary concern was looking at drop-off and pickup areas for children. And I think if you look at this site plan, you note that there's only a single-car driveway at the south end and a garage. There's not a circle drive, nor is there a prospect of coming in and doing a circle here, because this area back here needs to be fenced off for play area. So I think that was our primary concern, and we'd like to receive some additional information about how the drop-off and pickup would function. I think you've got a letter at your places there from Ashby House and Heartland Early Education describing how that would work. But your options today would be to approve a motion to recommend approval of the Planned Development District. That would allow the applicants to know that this is an approved use for this location. And then I think you see in your packet, there were a number of building code and fire code related issues that needed to be addressed before it could open as a child care center. But this would be a first step to say this is an approved land use. The other option would be to recommend denial of the zoning change or postpone consideration if you believe additional information is needed to make a recommendation. With that, I'd be open to any questions of staff, and we do have representatives from both Ashby House and Heartland here to answer any questions.
Any questions of staff? Would someone from the applicant like to address the commission, please? Your name and
Hi,
address?
my name is Brian Anderson, 448 South 9th, and I am the administrator of Ashby House. What I'd like to do is just give a little bit of background so you have a full understanding of what we do, and then also we have a representative from the Heartland programs that would like to speak to the specific part of that program. Ashby House is a homeless shelter. We started in 1992, and we serve families and individual women. When we look at the family side, which is what we're interested in with this, is the fact that we have children at Ashby House. We shelter about 150 families a year. An important aspect of that is that about 70% of those families are from the Salina area. In fact, most of them are from Salina. In those 150 families, then we have quite a number of children who range in age from newborn up, and the average probably is preschool, early elementary. We do have some older children, but most of our kids are younger children, and they're younger families. In looking at this project, and we've had a great concern for many, many years on how we can better serve the children, the homeless children that we work with. And one of those ideas that we've actually been had kind of in the back of our mind for a number of years is to be able to provide early education for those kids and also child care. It's very difficult because of the poverty that these families live in to make or to have a lot of options. And so having a child care center and early education near our or on our campus is certainly a benefit for the families that we work with. We are looking at having 15 preschool age kids and 4 infant toddler age children in this facility. Of course, the location of it to our shelter, to our offices, and to our program is ideal. And the other thing that we are looking at is that we really like to provide a home setting for our families. And of course, Ashby House itself is a very home setting. It's very comfortable for the families, and being able to have child care right across the street is a great benefit for them. Transportation is always a problem, and to be able to transport kids to a child care center or a child care provider is often difficult. And so this gives us an opportunity to really serve the children of Salina who are really facing some very difficult times, and also for the parents who are trying to work through their problems as well. I'd like to have Corey Powell-Hensley come up and talk specifically about the child care program because she's the expert in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Corey Powell-Hensley. Actually, I go by Corey Hensley now, 36 Willow Lake, Lynchburg, Kansas. And I am an employee of USD 305. This project that we're talking about would be specifically run by Heartland Programs in collaboration with Ashby House. And I think one of the big differences that we have with this and other commercial child care centers is this would not be a commercial child care center. It would be strictly not-for-profit and sponsored by the school district. It will help people go to work so they can be productive, tax-paying citizens. Parking, I know, was brought up as an issue. We anticipate only having 7 to 8 families actually being dropped off and picked up there, children picking up there, because we anticipate about half of the children of the 19 that we'll serve will be Ashby House residents, so they would just walk across the street. The other half, we hope, would be community children in that neighborhood, which is really important now, too, because Salina Child Care is going to be moving out of that neighborhood. So those low-income families in the neighborhood who would qualify for Head Start services could walk or be driven over there. Because parents drive their children to pick up and drop off for child care, depending on their work schedule, we really only anticipate 1 to 3 children ever being dropped off or picked up at the same time. And if you would look at the plot, there are 3 parking spots right in front of the Ashby House, and then there's 7 or 6, I think, right on the side. So you can see on 8th Street, there's 3 slots right there that would be really easy for families to park in those slots and drop off their children. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 along Walnut Street, although we don't really anticipate needing those as well, because we only anticipate maybe 1 to 3 children being dropped off or picked up at one time. Across Walnut Street is a parking space that's provided by Ashby House where our employees will park. So they would be on off-street parking, as in that picture right there. So parking wouldn't be an issue there. Facilities improvement, we really want that house to stay a part of the neighborhood and look part of the neighborhood. So with the work that Ashby House will do with our involvement, that house will stay the way it is, except it's going to be painted and look nicer. A privacy fence would be put around the back side of the house for playgrounds, so the children would be safe, and yet residents wouldn't have to look at the playground equipment because they might not feel that that's very inducive for their neighborhood. But we want to keep the integrity of the house as beautiful as it is today, and certainly the neighborhood as beautiful as it is today. These are the most vulnerable children we have in our community. They are from homeless families or parents who are substance abusers. They need high-quality child care plus the other services that Head Start provides. We do home visiting with the families on a regular basis. We provide them information on nutrition, health services. We help them find positions in the community. We help them do resumes and fill out applications. We help them get educational opportunities through Heartland so that they can be more productive citizens. So I really hope you consider this as a viable option for some of our most vulnerable community citizens. Are there any questions you might have?
I think I read that you're only using the main floor, the first floor.
Yes.
And how many square feet would that be then?
I think it's 1,900 square feet.
Okay.
I also want to mention that we have been working with the architect Charles Rentz from Jones, Gillum, and Rentz, and he's completed a code footprint, and he's either sent it in today or he'll be sending it in tomorrow to the city to start reviewing on. So we have been taking all of the suggestions that we're getting from the city that we need to have, and we're trying to look at incorporating all of those things into the plans as we move forward.
I'm very happy to hear that the exterior of the house will look the same. It's a gorgeous house, and certainly a porch that's very striking, and I know if it's anything like the rest of your properties, it'll be tastefully done.
We do know that we are going to have to do some renovations, ADA requirements, a ramp, bathrooms, smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, and we know about all of those things, and we appreciate the city and the fire department and licensing coming out and helping us look at all of those issues that might be involved.
Do you anticipate any use at all for the second floor for offices or?
No, and what we plan to do, if sometime in the future we want to look at using the second floor, then we'll come back to the process and make sure that we do that properly, because we understand that what we're looking at today, whatever we do in the future would have an effect on that, so we would have to come back to the process for that. But at this time, no plans for the second floor. So
The residential area to the, I can't remember the direction, Would you have any screening or anything in that area?
There will be to the west and also to the south. Where you see the garage along the bottom
Yes.
of the picture, there will be a fence that will come all the way up about 2/3 to the front of the house. And then also along the west property line, all the way up to Walnut, and then again back from Walnut, along Walnut back about halfway up into the house.
And that'll be your outdoor play area?
Yes, yes.
Now, we don't anticipate fencing in that concrete drive or the garage.
That's correct.
And so that would give more of a barrier to the property that's north or south of us. So that would give them a little bit more barrier as well.
Oh,
Is that correct?
the
The
fence,
fence would be to the north of the drive?
That's correct. It would separate the garage from the house.
And do you anticipate using that drive at all for drop-off and pickup?
We are looking at the possibility of drop-off for handicap, and we're also looking at, of course, putting in a ramp, wheelchair ramp, and so there is that possibility for drop-off at that driveway. The other driveway that's along Walnut will not be used for that.
where will the ramp be?
Well, we're looking at two different options, coming up the south side of the house and actually then joining on to the porch. So we would cut in a little area into the porch railing to make that access. The other side of the house has an option also that the ramp would basically come off of those stairs and then would turn and go back, because I think we need about 40 to 45 feet because of the height of the porch to do that. And so those are the two options we're looking at.
But not from the front.
That's correct, right. Yeah, and that's one thing we had consideration for, was that we absolutely don't want to interfere with the front view of the house.
I guess that'd be a question for Mr. Stack. If we had drop-off there on the north side off of Walnut and a ramp on the north side there, would we need to be looking at doing some kind of curb cut there to get them from vehicles up there?
Yeah, we'd have to look at that. Is that right in that picture right there?
This is the north view, and if we had some discussion with the architect about putting a ramp, as Brian described it, coming off this side, which if you were dropping somebody off, you'd probably do a drop-off here and come in that way, but it may possibly necessitate doing something in the way of a curb ramp there.
Mm-hmm.
We're not far enough along at this point, other to know that we're going to look to make it accessible. We're not far enough along to know what side is the best side to make it accessible.
Can you give us a little bit of an idea what you're thinking for fencing material?
We have not really considered exactly what we're going to use on that yet. Again, to maintain the historic look of the house, we're going to keep that in mind. We do want to have it as a privacy fence, though, so it will probably be wood, just like a cedar fence. We don't know exactly what the design will be.
This is not part of a historic preservation
I'll
district?
defer that to Mr. Berger. This could surprisingly be in the BID, couldn't it, John?
It's on the outside edge of the BID, which runs down 8th Street, so it is actually outside of that. This is a conservation district property, but that's a minimal protection just from demolition. It's not individually designated or part of a historic district at this point.
Will there be any signage at this facility?
If there is, it will be, it'll be minimal, and it may be as much as a sign on the door, but we don't anticipate anything out in front.
No grandiose yard signs or
No, no.
Illuminated,
a digital sign?
And get your hopes up.
flashing,
Moving billboard?
time and...
Well, and one of the reasons for that, and I know signage is used for advertising, and we really aren't looking for that, so
Yeah.
it'll mostly just be for identification.
Thank you.
Who will actually own this property then?
Ashby House does own it
Oh,
and
okay.
will continue to,
All
yes.
right.
Yeah.
Are the numbers of children that you're talking about serving, have they been consistent over a number of years? In other words, your anticipations for these numbers, has it been that way for the last 5 years, the last 10 years?
It's been actually pretty consistent. About 5.5 years ago, we started doing more substance abuse treatment, and that has kept some families longer in our program, 3 to 5 months. And so we've seen, at that point, we've seen an increase in the number of children that we work with on a consistent basis. Otherwise, we kind of would go up and down, and there really is no explanation for it. It's just coincidental. But with that substance abuse program, we've had longer-term residents. And I know that right at this point, with the 4 slots for the infant and toddler spot, we can fill that right now because that's how many infant and toddlers we have in our program. So.
Thank you.
Has notification been given to the neighbors? Is this,
Yes, this was a standard public hearing with a 200-foot notice. I think if I counted correctly, we sent out something like 29 individual notices.
okay, and you didn't receive any?
John, did you receive any commentary?
We haven't received any comments from neighboring property owners.
I haven't personally received any phone calls.
Will there be any lighting requirements that would be any different than, say, a normal residential house there that you can think of?
No.
What's the number of children that you're going to, average number of children that you'll be taking care of?
We're planning on 15 preschoolers and 4 infants and toddlers, and we cannot go over that amount because we're federally funded, and those are the amount that we would have to have. So sometimes fewer than that, but never more than that.
On average, how long will they be with you?
Some of them will be with us on average. Boy, that's a hard one. 1 year to 3 or 4 years.
And how many staff members for those 19 children will you have?
We anticipate having probably 3 to 4 at a time. Now, because childcare would start, we don't know exactly when, but probably 7 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the evening. That's more than an 8-hour day. So that means we would have to have a different shift,
Right.
you know, in the opening, but never more than 4 at a time there.
And those people would park across the street?
Exactly.
I might also add an answer to Dr. Hodges' question. One thing that we see is that a lot of the families who stay at Ashby House end up living in the neighborhood. And so even when those children start services while they're in shelter, they will continue to receive those services while they move back into the community. Because it just seems to be that a lot of our folks settle in those neighborhoods. A lot of services available, and of course with a child care center that would be an attraction for them too. We are within 1 block of our transportation transfer station. So even people who don't have a car, you can get anywhere in Salina from the corner of 7th and Walnut. And so it's a really benefit there also.
And how many infants will you take care of?
4.
4. It'll stay at 4, maybe less sometime.
Right.
But never more than 4.
Right.
Correct. Licensing states that if they're all under the age of 12 months, you can only have 3. So if we have babies, little babies, it'll go down, but it'll never go up. And that's a Head Start regulation.
Do you have a nurse who works there?
We have a nurse that works at Heartland Program. We have 3 nurses who will come and spend certainly time with the children, but they won't be there every day. But that's part of the services that we also provide, is that we train them on health needs, health concerns. We get them connected to physicians in the community. We get immunizations, all of those screenings done. That's a big part of what we do.
Do you have any pediatricians who will come at your biddance if you think you got a problem?
No, but we might have one OB-GYN.
We, Ashby House has a pediatrician on our board of directors, so I think we're covered there.
I hope you're not having children there, born there. Okay.
No, no.
Any further questions of the applicant or any of their representatives? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions of staff? I would entertain a motion if you are past the discussion stage.
We need to check and see if there's anything in the public. I don't see
Well,
anybody, but better make sure.
Is there anyone here from the public that would like to comment on this application, as this is a public hearing?
You never know.
None being seen, and the absence of contact, John there, I think we're okay in that respect.
I would move that we approve application PDD 10-2, and I don't think there were any other staff stipulations, were there?
We didn't have any special stipulations, but I did write a note to myself that we should put in there that signage would be allowed consistent with other conditional uses in R3 districts. That would make them consistent with churches, schools, YMCA, things of that nature.
And John, doesn't the Heritage District also have some signage rules as well?
It wouldn't pertain to this property because it's not individually designated. It's in a broader overall conservation district that only protects it from demolition, so there's no signage requirements.
Yeah. I'll second that then.
Been moved and seconded to approve, pardon my mouse here. Application PDD 10-2. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None being heard, motion carries.
We'll see what the city commission says.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or see if there's any protests then. Alyssa, show that Mr. Kennedy is back in session,
Back on board.
back on the job, back on the clock. All right, item number 4. Consider adoption of local stormwater pollution prevention ordinances, illicit discharge and erosion sediment control in order to comply with KDHE and EPA requirements. These ordinance drafts were sent to an ad hoc review committee for additional study by the Planning Commission on August 21st, 2007.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to point out that this is a result of a federal mandate passed down through the state of Kansas, as are many of the things we deal with, like floodplain and flood insurance and things like that. They're not necessarily optional. This first involved the Planning Commission at a study session and then a follow-up public hearing that was specifically designed to get people in the design community and contractors aware that this set of programs on stormwater pollution prevention was coming down the pike, and that they should be aware of it and getting involved, especially to look at what our local standards were going to be. At the conclusion of the hearing on August 21st, the Planning Commission passed a motion to recommend that an ad hoc committee consisting of design professionals, contractors, and at least 2 planning commissioners be formed to review the language in the draft ordinances, to provide input on what we should be doing at a local level. And we summarize for you, we had Glenn Knack, professional engineer, Donnie Mars, a local architect, Quentin Robo, who's a utilities contractor, Bob Miller, a general contractor, Jim Mays, a developer, Wayne Schneider, former planning commissioner, and Monroe Funk, former planning commissioner, and Bob Hayworth, home builder. That constituted our ad hoc committee. And before you have a memo in there from the Deputy City Manager, Mike Scragg, outlining how this was done, how the committee operated. But before we go to that, I would introduce Wayne Nelson, the civil engineer. He has a brief PowerPoint for you that will have some photographs and pictures that would illustrate some of the things that this is designed to address. So if you've got that ready, John, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Nelson, and you've got a copy of the presentation there, but Wayne will go through some of the slides for you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Many of you on the commission weren't sitting on the commission when we last visited this topic back in 2007. As Dean mentioned, the Phase 2 permit is something that was born out of the federal government and the Environmental Protection Agency. It went into effect in the late 1990s with what was designated as Phase 1 cities, cities larger than 100,000 in population, and then the Phase 2 cities were classified as between 10,000 and 100,000 in population. A number of requirements were put on the Phase 1 and Phase 2 cities as to what they are to accomplish as part of the program, with the general goal being a reduction of pollutants from construction site and illicit discharges from various areas within the community, and generally non-source or non-point source points of pollution, and then a general education for the community to help educate the populace in changing their practices of discharging materials that would be considered a pollutant to our waterways and surface waters of our areas. So, John? So the three areas that we're looking at are the illicit discharge and detection elimination ordinance, a construction site stormwater runoff control, which deals with sediment and erosion from construction sites, and then the post-construction stormwater runoff control, which is the area that has been most confusing to everybody, including those of us in Salina. But those are the issues that we've been dealt with to work with, and we've been doing our best to move forward with that. The illicit discharge and elimination system begins with a good drainage map, so that we know where our storm sewers discharge into the waterways here within the city. Requires monitoring and enforcement of activities and public education. The prevention of illicit discharge is really aimed mostly at the storm system, typically from commercial and industrial sources, and then the public education part is really an encouragement of recycling of petroleum, paint, and other household hazardous materials. Wash water from homes and businesses is really targeted more towards washing with soaps and detergents and solvents, and preventing driveways or pavements and other areas being washed down with these harsher chemicals and pollutants before they would enter into the stormwater system. So why are we doing this? Well, simply, one, it's the law, and it's a good idea to steward and husband our natural resources. But the driving factor, of course, is the Environmental Protection Agency has mandated that the cities across the United States have a program to control these issues. So who's the responsible party in this? Well, it's your responsibility, and it's the owner or the responsible party of a property, construction site, to make sure that the sediment is kept off the adjacent properties, out of the streets, and most importantly, out of the storm drainage systems. And as you can see, that includes tracking of mud from off of the construction site, from the contractors delivering materials, concrete trucks bringing in concrete to build streets and sidewalks and other vehicles. So if your name is the name that is listed on the notice of intent, which is the permit that is required from the state of Kansas to identify how you are going to address these issues with your construction site, you are the responsible party. The construction site runoff control requires BMPs, and BMP is an acronym for Best Management Practice. The BMPs would include such items as silt fences, wattles, temporary sediment or detention ponds, ground cover to keep soils from running off, or to trap soils from running into a stream. It serves to reduce pollutants in stormwater from runoff from construction and land disturbance projects. The implementation of erosion and sediment control requires items to be controlled, such as discarded building materials, concrete truck washout, chemicals, litter, sanitary waste, and then penalties for non-compliance could range from a variety of things, from fines to stop work orders. Let's see where I am with. So the erosion and sediment control ordinance would apply to land disturbance activities. It's recommended that the land disturbance permit is used for tracking the NPDES activities. It gives the city a tool to monitor soil disturbance activities. Currently, we have nothing in place that really provides us an opportunity to track a number of the soil disturbance activities prior to issuance of a building permit. So there's a lot of activity that can occur before a building permit is issued and before the city can be involved in the activities going on a construction site. And that's important because the state of Kansas has issued the city of Salina a general permit to where we are responsible for the condition of our municipal stormwater system, and non-compliance with our permit gets the city in trouble. So it's a cascading effort. The soil erosion and sediment control, SESC, requires a stormwater pollution prevention plan, frequently referred to as a SWIP. It's a document that shows how runoff issues will be addressed and when they will be addressed. It's the document that shows how the construction site will be dealt with, when BMPs will be erected, when they'll be taken down, when construction activities start and begin. So it's the planning and the phasing of all of the measures, and then ultimately to the final stabilization of the of the site. So how does the City of Salina help with this? Well, we will be adopting and maintaining erosion and sediment control standards. We'll have development guidance manuals and provide builders with materials to educate in the use of the BMPs. This is an example of one of our construction sites. This is actually on an eyebrow on a street to where the contractor has used the public right-of-way and the public street, for that matter, as a staging site for his delivery of soils and materials. This is just an example of runoff coming from a site having filled into a curb and gutter, showing how quickly, even on a flat construction site like we have in much of Salina, that material does move off of the sites and into the city storm system. And of course, the curb and gutter is an intricate part of our storm sewer collection system. Another example, again, this is in South Salina, another flat part of town, but you can see the sediment has got out and choked the curb and gutter entirely to where the water is now halfway out across the street on this side of the pavement. Now this is actually a photo of a concrete wash to a designated wash area. So this is an example of good management practice here, utilizing a designated area for washout of the truck after delivery of a load of concrete. An example of a silt fence on a residential area, and a construction entrance which is utilized to where the idea behind it is that it provides an entry into and out of the construction site, and the gravel is of such size that it's hoped that most of the material caught on the vehicle tires and tracks will be knocked off and left on the construction entrance, and minimizing the amount of disturbance coming out onto the street. Inlet protection, silt fence around a storm inlet during construction activity. And this is another example of a wash area for concrete trucks. Erosion matting put down on a slope on a construction site. The contains, stabilizes the area around the what would otherwise be a bare or freshly seeded area of the construction site. The post-construction stormwater management, as I mentioned earlier, has been the most problematic for many of the cities throughout not only Kansas but across the nation. But will require the post-development runoff peaks to meet existing runoff conditions, reduce impervious surfaces in new developments, develop a program for maintenance of the stormwater facilities. Now already we have in current city code, we have requirements for detention of excess runoff from development. So we actually do have at least a portion of the post-construction management already in place. Some of the other items that we will be utilizing for post-construction management are listed up here on this slide, and I would add that the city has a post-construction BMP manual which was developed with our fellow Stormwater Consortium cities, and provides a uniformity across the state in the devices that we have available to us for our post-construction management. So in summary, general compliance with the general permit, 3 ordinances, the illicit discharge, construction site runoff, post-construction runoff. We'll be adding a land disturbance permit to better track activity through the city, and then there'll be a requirement for a SWIP for individual lots, generally when it's related to a development of a larger size.
So now I'd like to turn it over to Deputy City Manager Mike Scragg, and he's got a memorandum he addressed to you that kind of described the work of the committee and what's been occurring since this last was in the Planning Commission's hands.
Good afternoon. As Dean said, I'm Mike Scragg. As I'm sure you noticed in Wayne's presentation, the deadline for this was October of 2007, and as I'm sure you're aware, it's not October of 2007 today. This is something that we have been working on. Admittedly, it's taken longer than I would have liked. I served as the facilitator of the ad hoc committee, and I say facilitator, I don't want to give you the impression that we wrote an ordinance by committee. We took them a draft, and we started with the draft that the staff had prepared and presented to the Planning Commission back in September as kind of a starting point, and that was met with a healthy skepticism in terms of the provisions of that ordinance and did we really want to do this. And that was skepticism in spite of it being a federal mandate, or maybe because it was a federal mandate, I'm not sure, but nonetheless there was a lot of question about, do we really have to do this? There's a lot of comparison with other communities that the committee members were familiar with that hadn't done anything at all or weren't enforcing requirements like this. And so we spent quite a bit of time looking at the starting point that we used, which at the time was Johnson County, Kansas, and admittedly the terrain is different in Johnson County, Kansas, and the development climate is different, such that they're a little bit more comfortable with just kind of imposing requirements, and they are what they are. So we kind of backed up and looked at any guidance that EPA on a federal level could provide, and frankly, there was plenty of documents, but I don't know that we felt like they were all that helpful. We were also in contact with the local KDHE, and they were helpful in terms of the timelines and those type of things, but again, couldn't provide much in the way of examples. In addition to Johnson County, there's a group called the Mid-America Regional Council that had taken a real comprehensive approach to this issue, developed a point system that was pretty complex. We looked at that and didn't think that was very applicable to our circumstances. So we tried to modify our ordinance in response to the ad hoc committee's concerns. And while all that was going on, Wayne referenced the Clean 12 Consortium. There was a group that went together and hired Wilson and Company to do some work and try to prepare a draft ordinance. And so simultaneously, we chose to financially participate so that we could have access to what they produced as well to look at. And so quite a bit of time elapsed. But what also happened then is quite a few communities finalized ordinances and adopted them, and we started to have a basis of comparison so that we weren't on the leading edge of this issue. We could kind of see how we compared with other communities. And so as we modified the ordinance and as those ordinances were adopted by other communities, we then prepared the comparisons that you should have before you and provided the committee a comparison of the illicit discharge ordinance and the erosion and sediment control ordinance of all the communities that we could find. And I've got to give Wayne credit. He read every one of those ordinances, and then he came in and I was able to pick his brain and try to work with him to create this comparison. And I won't walk you through the entire comparison. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, but we did go through it in detail with the committee, and I think the conclusion that I came away with, and I think the committee came away with, was we weren't as far out of sync with those other communities. They had a sense of how our ordinance compared with the other communities, and that our ordinance was not dissimilar or exceptionally onerous. We did go through some of the concerns, and we modified the ordinance one last time in response to their feedback. And in my memo, I identified 7 items that were topics of conversation at that last meeting that did not result in specific ordinance amendments to the proposed ordinance. So I did want to, in interest of full disclosure on behalf of the committee, go over those with you at a minimum. One of the concerns was swimming pool water and what are the harmful effects of discharging swimming pool water, and is there a standard for that? And at the time, we weren't aware of just typical chlorine levels in comparison to the standard of 1 part per million as being the threshold. And what I was able to find is a rule of thumb that 1 to 3 parts per million is the recommended chlorine level in a pool while it's in use. For those, I apologize if I'm telling you things you already know, but over time you just lose the chlorine residual out of water if you don't continue to add chlorine. So I think some of the assumption is that if you wanted to empty your pool at the end of the year with a little bit of effort, either just letting the water stand, you could allow that to dissipate. Additionally, then, that measurement is at the point of discharge into the receiving water. It's not necessarily in the curb line. It's at the ultimate point of discharge into the receiving water. So don't know that this absolutely prohibits discharging pool water. The intent is you don't want to have that chlorine hit the receiving water and kill, organisms and things like that.
Mike, I might just add that typically chlorine gets more eaten up or destroyed by sunlight. So if your pool, just leave it vacant, don't add any additional chlorine to it, it'll get zapped out of there pretty quickly. And then the concern with chlorine being discharged into streams or into the storm system is that chlorine will react with organic materials, and then that'll form haloacetic acids and trihalomethanes, which then are known carcinogens. So it's a possibility of adding a organic chemical compound into the system, and then for those waters that are used for drinking water, such as Salina and then more downstream, Lawrence, Manhattan, then those become a problem to remove from the system for their testing and use.
The next two items deal with washing parking lots, and there was considerable discussion in the committee about kind of the current practice in terms of washing parking lots, and operators sense that they're doing a good thing by washing their parking lot, but they do wash it off and let it run off, and that is an identified prohibited illicit discharge in the proposed ordinance. One point of clarification is the wash water itself isn't necessarily prohibited. It's the degreasers, emulsifiers, soaps, those type of things. So we had a little bit of conversation about, was it practical to think that you could wash without soap or any of those items and be okay? Still becomes a concern about what's on the parking lot in the first place. What is it that you're washing off? And there was some discussion that there is an EPA cleanup standard that gas stations in particular follow in terms of size of spill, and if it's above a certain threshold, then they have to follow a protocol. And we didn't incorporate all that into the ordinance. There was some general acknowledgement that it's going to require some discretion on the part of staff, and the city engineer in particular is the person that's in charge of administering this, of exercising that discretion in terms of application and enforcement. So we didn't go so far as to try to quantify those types of spills and quantities. We just left the more typical language that we saw elsewhere. The fourth item was we have some illicit discharges that currently exist that will become violations. And the ordinance does contemplate a 90-day period. I don't want to say a moratorium or a grace period, but there is 90-day implementation period. And so if we know of any existing problems, our intention would be to be in contact with them more directly about the requirements and about solutions. But nonetheless, that doesn't, just by the fact that they're in existence today, doesn't necessarily grandfather in an illicit discharge of those items that are spelled out as being prohibited in the ordinance. Then similarly, the ordinance talks about the possibility of the city forcibly disconnecting an illegal connection. And while that is a possibility, the committee raised that, if you don't think that through, you may cause a flooding problem. Whatever was being discharged is going to have to go somewhere. And again, that's where it's going to take some discretion on city staff's part. I wouldn't anticipate that we would knowingly disconnect a connection that's going to flood an adjoining property or whatever the case may be. That's kind of that's along the lines of abatement when we're not able to accomplish any other, voluntary compliance. and I think at best it would be on a case-by-case basis. Fees were not something that was really addressed by the committee. We adopt fees in the city by a separate resolution, and our intention would be to do that simultaneously, but establish a fee not as a revenue generator, but in keeping with site plan review fees, those type of fees that we already have in place. And then the last item was some concern about, there is language that a final certificate of occupancy wouldn't be issued until everything was in compliance. And there was discussion about the financial circumstances of going from a construction loan to a conventional loan and the need for that final certificate of occupancy, and could this hold that up? And we currently deal with that in terms of temporary certificates of occupancy and compliance agreements. So the conclusion of all that discussion was, we think we can just respond in the way that we currently do on a case-by-case basis of if it is a financial loan issue, a bank requirement, we might be able to do a temporary certificate of occupancy, execute a compliance agreement, get something on paper that we have an agreement of what remains to be done, and that it will be installed such that the bank understands the project's not in jeopardy. And if that isn't the case, if that continues to be a problem, that might be something that we come back and amend the ordinance for. So those were the items that the committee specifically raised that I felt like I needed to bring to your attention. Beyond that, because of the process, the way that we did it, and as I said, this is somewhat drafting an ordinance by committee, it was not as formal as a motion and a second to amend and proposing language. It was more the committee raising concerns, staff taking that back and trying to draft a language in response to that. So we did not ask them to just straight up vote in support or opposition to the final draft. It was more of a consent. Does this represent a consensus of what we've been talking about for the last 2.5 years? And the consensus was that it did. So we're bringing to you these two ordinances as our revised drafts after dealing with working with the ad hoc committee, and after comparing them to other peer communities, we think that it's fairly representative of what the other communities are doing. Having said that, there is a little bit more detail in our ordinance with respect to plan contents and design criteria. I think it's safe to say that if a design professional is preparing those plans without our language, that should still be their intent anyway, but we've tried to reduce that to writing so that as we review them, there's no confusion about what has to be on those plans. With that, I hope that wasn't too long and detailed, but I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
I'd first of all like to say thanks to all the committee members who served on that. I talked to Wayne Snyder and Monroe Funk a little bit, who served on that committee and initially, and said that the information was voluminous and pretty dry.
And we met at 7 in the morning and kept them there for 2 to 2.5 hours. So.
Yeah, those guys were troopers. Yeah, and then there was an initial guideline that you guys had to, initial time frame that you guys had a really short period of time to get that done in, right?
Well, yeah, and I should come back to that. Engineering staff, Wayne mentioned our general permit, and we've been in contact with KDHE as that permit's been renewed, and they've not forgotten about us. In fact, we're probably pressing our luck at being at this point in the process where we are, but we've kept them informed of what we're doing and assured them that we're trying to come up with an ordinance that's acceptable to the community and meets their standards. So I wouldn't want to have to wait much longer, but I think we've kept them as informed as we could.
I didn't see anything in here about junkyards.
We have a separate salvage yard ordinance. I think there is one provision about runoff from junkyards and cars, that type of thing.
I may have dozed off at that.
Well, it's one bullet point at best. It's not much.
Yeah, I was just going to say, are we needing to vote on this? Because I'm bored suitably enough to vote yes. Just to get on with this,
My plan worked.
Yeah, you guys have really...
Yeah, it's more brought back to you as a matter of professional courtesy that the Planning Commission came up with the idea to form the ad hoc committee. They've done their work. We're reporting back to you what we've done.
It's great, fabulous. What do we think? Great, fantastic. Where do we go from here?
But that is addressed separately there's a separate ordinance that deals with junkyards and salvage yards, and that actually is addressed separately in that ordinance and tied back to this.
Okay.
Unless you object, we will be presenting this in study session to the City Commission with a recommendation that we adopt and that should be happening fairly quickly.
I absolutely think they should go through this.
I think so too.
Yeah.
They actually get paid. Yeah. Not much. Yeah. Could you go into detail?
Thank you
More pictures.
very much, and thank you,
Yeah,
Wayne. That was a lot of work, I know.
But it will, as we bring forward subdivision plats and we bring home site plans, you'll be hearing us talk about those issues where you probably hadn't heard about it in the past, and how are they going to deal with erosion, how are they going to phase construction, how's this subdivision going to develop? So you'll be hearing about it more, and it may be referenced, but you won't be administering this, thankfully for you.
Yeah. Well, reading through this, I was just wondering about the enforcement of all this. That sounds like it's going to be a issue in itself.
I saw a reference to the building official in here, I thought. Oh.
Other matters?
Other matters, we will have a regular meeting on the 20th, your next regularly scheduled meeting, and we have a request by Caw Valley, what are they calling themselves? Caw Valley Greenhouses?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
They are wanting to do something similar to Stutzman's, but much less long-term, basically a 90-day or 3-month type operation, but they're wanting to do it up on Diamond Drive at the former Ponderosa restaurant site up there. That's one of the items scheduled, and hopefully the motel on South 9th will have their work done by that time.
Very good. Thank you. We are adjourned.